Sarah Martinez walked through the dusty courtyard of Forward Operating Base Phoenix, her boots crunching against the gravel as the Afghan sun beat down mercilessly. At 28, she appeared to be just another mid-level intelligence analyst, her uniform bearing the insignia of a captain. What the other soldiers didn't know was that Sarah carried credentials that went far beyond what her visible rank suggested. Colonel James Morrison stood near the briefing tent. His chest puffed out as he barked orders at a group of junior officers. His weathered face bore the permanent scowl of a man who believed the world owed him respect simply because of the eagles on his collar. When he spotted Sarah approaching, his expression shifted to one of barely concealed disdain. "Well, well. If it isn't our little intelligence princess," Morrison called out loud enough for the nearby soldiers to hear. Several of them shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the inappropriate tone. "What brings you out of your air-conditioned office today, Captain? Finally decided to see how real soldiers work?" Sarah stopped a few feet away from Morrison, her expression remaining neutral despite the colonel's obvious attempt to humiliate her in front of his men. She had dealt with men like Morrison countless times throughout her military career. They saw her gender and assumed weakness, saw her relatively young age and assumed inexperience, saw her intelligence role and assumed she was soft. "Colonel Morrison, I need to discuss the latest intelligence reports with you," Sarah said calmly, her voice carrying just enough authority to make some of the nearby soldiers take notice. "There are developments that require immediate attention." Morrison let out a harsh laugh, turning to his audience of junior officers. "Did you hear that, boys? The little analyst thinks she has something important to tell me. 15 years I've been in active combat zones, sweetheart. I was fighting real wars when you were probably still in college playing soldier in ROTC." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a mortar blast. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever someone dismissed her capabilities based on assumptions. But she had learned long ago that responding with anger only gave men like Morrison more ammunition. Instead, she took a measured breath and maintained her professional demeanor. "Sir, with respect, the intelligence I'm carrying is time-sensitive and relates to a potential threat against this base," she continued, her tone remaining steady. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately." Morrison's face reddened slightly, whether from the heat or irritation, Sarah couldn't tell. "Listen here, Captain," he spat, emphasizing her rank like it was something distasteful. "I've been running operations since before you knew which end of a rifle to hold. I don't need some desk jockey telling me about threats to my own base." The group of junior officers watched the exchange with growing discomfort. Most of them had worked with Captain Martinez before and knew she was highly competent, but challenging a colonel in public was career suicide for anyone of their rank. They remained silent, trapped between their respect for Sarah's abilities and their fear of Morrison's retaliation. Sarah glanced around at the faces surrounding them, recognizing the position these men were in. She made a mental note of each one, not in anger but in understanding. Military hierarchy was a powerful force, and she knew these soldiers were simply protecting their own careers. "Colonel, I understand your experience is extensive," Sarah said, choosing her words carefully. "However, the intelligence I've received suggests there may be an imminent attack planned for tonight. The source is highly reliable and the details are specific enough that I believe we should take immediate defensive measures." Morrison stepped closer, using his height advantage in an obvious attempt to intimidate her. "You know what your problem is, Martinez? You think because you sit in that little intelligence office pushing papers around, you understand warfare. But intelligence is just guesswork dressed up in fancy reports. Real soldiers deal with facts, not theories." The irony of his statement wasn't lost on Sarah. In reality, she had more field experience than Morrison could ever imagine, but her current cover required her to maintain the appearance of being a simple intelligence analyst. Her actual role in military operations was so classified that even base commanders weren't typically briefed on it. "Sir, I've prepared a detailed briefing packet that outlines the specific threats. Sarah tried again, pulling a manila folder from her cargo pocket. If you could just review the materials, I think you'll find the intelligence compelling. Morrison glanced at the folder dismissively. I don't have time to read bedtime stories, Captain. I have real work to do. Why don't you run along back to your office and let the grown-ups handle base security? The comment drew a few uncomfortable chuckles from some of the junior officers, though others looked openly embarrassed by their colonel's behavior. Sarah noticed Lieutenant Reynolds, a young officer she had worked with on previous intelligence assessments, looking particularly uncomfortable. Sarah felt a flash of frustration, not at Morrison's personal attacks, but at his willingness to potentially endanger the lives of everyone on the base because of his ego. She had seen too many good soldiers die because of pride and stubbornness among senior officers. Colonel Morrison, I want to be very clear about this, Sarah said, her voice taking on a slightly harder edge. The intelligence indicates a coordinated attack involving multiple insurgent cells. They have detailed knowledge of our patrol schedules and defensive positions. This isn't speculation. This is actionable intelligence from multiple sources. Morrison's face grew redder. Are you questioning my judgment, Captain? Because it sounds like you're trying to tell me how to run my base. Maybe you've forgotten who's in charge here. I haven't forgotten anything, sir, Sarah replied evenly. I'm simply trying to ensure that all relevant information reaches the appropriate decision-makers. The appropriate decision-maker is me, Morrison snapped. And I've decided that your so-called intelligence isn't worth the paper it's printed on. Now, unless you have actual orders from someone who outranks me, I suggest you return to your duties and let me handle mine. Sarah looked around at the assembled group one more time. She could see in their faces that some of them believed her intelligence was credible, but none of them were willing to support her against Morrison's authority. In the rigid hierarchy of military command, Morrison's word was law, regardless of how wrong he might be. Very well, Colonel, Sarah said quietly. I've delivered the intelligence as required. How you choose to act on it is your decision. She turned to walk away, but Morrison's voice stopped her. Oh, and Martinez? Next time you think about wasting my time with your amateur hour intelligence work, remember that some of us have real responsibilities. Maybe stick to filing reports and leave the strategic thinking to people who actually know what they're doing. Sarah paused for a moment, her back still turned to Morrison. She thought about all the operations she had planned and executed, all the lives she had saved through careful intelligence work, all the enemy networks she had dismantled. But her cover identity required her to accept these insults in silence. Understood, sir, she said without turning around, then continued walking toward the intelligence office. As she made her way across the base, Sarah's mind was already working on alternative approaches. If Morrison wouldn't listen to official intelligence channels, she would have to find other ways to ensure the base was prepared for the coming attack. The lives of everyone on the base were more important than Morrison's ego or her own pride. Back at the briefing area, the junior officers slowly dispersed, many of them looking troubled by what they had witnessed. Lieutenant Reynolds lingered for a moment, watching Sarah's retreating figure with a thoughtful expression before Morrison barked at him to get back to work. What none of them knew was that Sarah Martinez held security clearances that went far beyond anything a simple captain should possess. Her real role in the military was so classified that only a handful of people in the entire chain of command knew her true identity. And Colonel Morrison's arrogance was about to put him on a collision course with forces he couldn't even imagine. The attack came exactly as Sarah had predicted, striking forward operating base Phoenix at 0347 hours when most of the garrison was asleep. The first explosion rocked the eastern perimeter, followed immediately by coordinated mortar fire that seemed to know exactly where to hit for maximum damage. The insurgents had clearly spent weeks studying the base's defensive patterns. Sarah was already awake when the first blast lit up the night sky. She had been monitoring communications channels and coordinating with assets that Colonel Morrison didn't even know existed. Her small intelligence office had been transformed into a makeshift command center with multiple encrypted communication devices that were far more sophisticated than anything a regular Army captain should have access to. Within seconds of the initial attack, her secure satellite phone buzzed with an incoming call from Langley. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, addressing her by a code name that Morrison had never heard. "Phoenix, this is Control. We're tracking the situation. Do you need immediate extraction?" Sarah watched through her reinforced window as tracer fire lit up the darkness and explosions continued to rock the base. "Negative, Control. I'm staying with the garrison, but I need authorization to break cover if necessary to coordinate the defense." "Authorized. Protect the asset at all costs." Sarah knew the asset they were referring to wasn't her, but rather the sensitive intelligence operation that had been running out of this base for the past 6 months. Information that could compromise ongoing operations across 3 countries was housed in the very building Morrison had been so eager to dismiss her concerns about. The sound of running boots echoed through the corridors as soldiers rushed to their defensive positions. Through her door, Sarah could hear panicked voices and the occasional bark of orders from senior non-commissioned officers trying to organize the response. But notably absent was the commanding voice of Colonel Morrison. Sarah quickly gathered her most critical equipment and stepped out into the hallway. The base's emergency lighting cast everything in an eerie red glow, and she could smell smoke from the fires that were already spreading from the eastern buildings. "Captain Martinez!" Lieutenant Reynolds appeared around the corner, his face streaked with dirt and his eyes wide with adrenaline. "Thank God you're okay. We're getting hammered out there. The colonel's trying to coordinate from the command bunker, but the communications are down." Sarah nodded grimly. The communications being down wasn't an accident. It was exactly what her intelligence had predicted. The insurgents had clearly infiltrated their communication networks and knew how to disrupt their coordination at the worst possible moment. "What's the current situation, Lieutenant?" she asked, falling into step beside Reynolds as they moved toward the command center. "They hit us from 3 sides simultaneously," Reynolds explained, ducking slightly as another explosion shook the building. "Mortars, small arms fire, and it looks like they might have infiltrators inside the perimeter. Colonel Morrison's trying to get situation reports from the platoon leaders, but without reliable communications, we're basically fighting blind." When they reached the command bunker, Sarah could immediately see the chaos that Morrison was struggling to contain. Maps were scattered across tables, radio operators were frantically trying to re-establish contact with various units, and Morrison himself was red-faced and shouting contradictory orders to anyone within earshot. "Where are my perimeter reports?" Morrison was yelling at a young sergeant who looked completely overwhelmed. "I need to know where these attacks are coming from." "Sir, we've lost contact with 2nd and 3rd platoons," the sergeant replied shakily. "The radio tower took a direct hit in the first wave." Morrison's eyes swept the room and landed on Sarah. Instead of recognizing her earlier warnings, his expression became even more hostile. "What are you doing here, Martinez? This is no place for intelligence personnel. Get back to your office where it's safe." Sarah felt a surge of anger, but more importantly, she could see that Morrison's incompetent leadership was going to get people killed. The attack was unfolding exactly as her intelligence had predicted, but Morrison was reacting to it like it was a random assault instead of the carefully coordinated operation it actually was. "Colonel, the communication disruption is part of their strategy," Sarah said firmly. "They're using electronic jamming equipment to isolate our units, but there are alternative communication protocols we can use." "I don't need tactical advice from an analyst," Morrison snapped back. "Just because you happen to be right about an attack doesn't mean you understand combat operations." Lieutenant Reynolds looked between the two of them, clearly recognizing that Sarah's assessment was more accurate than Morrison's panicked flailing. Several other junior officers in the bunker were nodding in agreement with Sarah's analysis. "Sir, Captain Martinez's intelligence has been spot on so far, Reynolds said cautiously. Maybe we should listen to her assessment of their tactics. Morrison whirled on the lieutenant. Are you questioning my command, Reynolds? Because if you are, I can have you relieved of duty right now. Another massive explosion rocked the bunker, and one of the radio operators called out urgently, Colonel, we're getting reports of enemy movement near the ammunition depot. They're trying to breach the southern perimeter. Sarah's blood ran cold. The ammunition depot was exactly where her intelligence had indicated the insurgents would focus their secondary assault. If they succeeded in destroying it, the explosion would level half the base and kill hundreds of soldiers. Colonel Morrison, that depot needs to be evacuated immediately, Sarah said with more urgency in her voice. The intelligence indicated they have specialized explosives designed specifically to trigger a chain reaction in our ammunition stores. Morrison's face contorted with rage. Enough! I am sick of your constant second-guessing and fear-mongering. Security around that depot is my responsibility, and I say it's adequate. Sarah looked around the command bunker at the faces of the junior officers and enlisted personnel. She could see doubt in their eyes, not about her assessment, but about Morrison's judgment. These were experienced soldiers who had learned to trust their instincts, and their instincts were telling them that Morrison was making dangerous mistakes. The radio crackled to life with a panicked transmission. Command, this is Bravo team at the ammunition depot. We've got movement all around our position. Looks like they're placing charges on the perimeter fence. We need reinforcements now. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't watch good soldiers die because of one man's pride and incompetence. Moving to one of the communication stations, she activated a frequency that Morrison didn't know existed and spoke in a clear, authoritative voice. All units, this is Operation Phoenix Actual. Implement Emergency Protocol 7. All personnel within 200 meters of the ammunition depot are to evacuate immediately to secondary positions. The entire command bunker fell silent. Morrison stared at Sarah in shock, not just because she had given orders without his authorization, but because of the way she had identified herself. Operation Phoenix Actual wasn't a designation that appeared on any organizational chart he had access to. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Morrison demanded. Before Sarah could answer, responses started coming in over the radio from unit commanders across the base, but they weren't responding to Morrison. They were responding to her orders with immediate compliance. Phoenix Actual, this is Alpha Company. Moving to secondary positions now. Phoenix Actual, Bravo team acknowledging. Falling back from depot perimeter. Phoenix Actual, this is base security, implementing Emergency Protocol 7. Morrison's face went white as he realized that soldiers throughout the base were taking orders from Captain Martinez without question, responding to her with a level of immediate obedience that suggested they recognized her authority as superseding his own. Lieutenant Reynolds was staring at Sarah with a mixture of awe and confusion. The other officers in the bunker had stopped what they were doing and were watching the exchange with growing understanding that something much bigger was happening than they had realized. Sarah turned to face Morrison directly. "Colonel, there are aspects of this situation that are beyond your current security clearance to understand. I need you to trust me and follow my lead for the safety of everyone on this base." Morrison's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. For the first time since Sarah had known him, the arrogant colonel was speechless, beginning to grasp that Captain Martinez was not at all what she appeared to be. The aftermath of the attack revealed the true scope of Sarah's capabilities and the depth of Colonel Morrison's ignorance about who he had been dealing with. As dawn broke over forward operating base Phoenix, the base was secure, the insurgent attack had been repelled with minimal casualties, and Morrison found himself face-to-face with a reality that shattered everything he thought he knew about military hierarchy. General Patricia Hawthorne arrived by helicopter at 800 hours, accompanied by a team of officials whose credentials Morrison couldn't even begin to interpret. The general's presence alone was enough to send shockwaves through the base command structure, but when she walked directly to Sarah Martinez and saluted her, the entire foundation of Morrison's understanding crumbled. "Ma'am, the situation is secure," Sarah reported to the general with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to briefing the highest levels of military command. "The asset was protected, and we were able to capture 3 of the insurgent leaders alive for interrogation." Morrison stood frozen in place, watching this exchange with growing horror. The general had saluted Sarah. A 3-star general had saluted a captain. That was impossible unless Sarah wasn't actually a captain at all. General Hawthorne nodded approvingly. "Excellent work, Colonel. Your decision to break cover was the right one under the circumstances. The intelligence you protected will be crucial for ongoing operations throughout the region." The word hit Morrison like a physical blow. "Colonel." The general had addressed Sarah as Colonel, but Sarah's uniform still bore captain's insignia. Unless. "General," Sarah continued, "I recommend a full security review of this base's command structure. There were significant failures in intelligence assessment and tactical response that nearly resulted in catastrophic losses." Morrison's knees felt weak. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Sarah Martinez wasn't a captain serving as an intelligence analyst. She was a colonel operating under deep cover, and her real role was so classified that even base commanders weren't briefed on her presence. General Hawthorne's sharp eyes found Morrison standing nearby, and her expression hardened. "Colonel Morrison, I presume?" Morrison struggled to find his voice. "Yes, ma'am. Colonel James Morrison, commanding officer of Forward Operating Base Phoenix." "Colonel Morrison," the general said coldly, "I understand you've been having some interesting interactions with one of our most valuable intelligence assets. Colonel Martinez has filed a report detailing your responses to her intelligence assessments. Would you care to explain why you dismissed actionable intelligence that could have prevented last night's casualties?" Morrison felt the blood drain from his face. Everything he had said to Sarah, every dismissive comment, every condescending remark, suddenly took on a completely different meaning. He hadn't been putting a junior officer in her place. He had been insulting a superior officer who had been trying to save lives. "General, I had no knowledge of Colonel Martinez's actual status," Morrison stammered. "Her visible rank indicated she was a captain in intelligence analysis." Sarah stepped forward. "General Hawthorne, Colonel Morrison was operating with the information available to him through normal channels. My cover identity was designed to be convincing, and he had no reason to suspect otherwise." Morrison looked at Sarah in surprise. Despite everything he had put her through, she was actually defending him to the general. The irony wasn't lost on him that the woman he had spent weeks humiliating was now trying to protect his career. General Hawthorne wasn't satisfied with Sarah's diplomatic response. "Colonel Martinez, your reports indicate that Colonel Morrison not only dismissed your intelligence assessments, but did so in a manner that was personally disparaging and professionally inappropriate. Is that accurate?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, glancing at Morrison. The colonel expressed skepticism about the intelligence, yes, ma'am. However, his primary concern appeared to be maintaining command authority in a complex operational environment. Morrison realized with growing shame that Sarah was deliberately downplaying his behavior. She could have destroyed his career with a single honest report about how he had treated her, but instead she was giving him an opportunity to salvage his reputation. Lieutenant Reynolds, who had been standing nearby listening to the exchange, stepped forward. "General, if I may, Captain Martinez." Colonel Martinez repeatedly tried to warn us about the attack. She provided specific, actionable intelligence that could have prevented the casualties we sustained. Colonel Morrison refused to review her reports or implement her recommended defensive measures. General Hawthorne's expression grew even more stern. "Is that accurate, Colonel Morrison?" Morrison looked around at the faces surrounding him. He could lie, try to minimize his failures, or attempt to shift blame. But looking at Sarah's calm, professional demeanor, despite everything he had put her through, he found he couldn't bring himself to add dishonesty to his list of failures. "Yes, ma'am," Morrison said quietly. "I dismissed Colonel Martinez's intelligence assessments without proper review. I allowed personal prejudices to cloud my professional judgment." The admission hung in the air like smoke from the previous night's explosions. General Hawthorne studied Morrison for a long moment, then turned to Sarah. "Colonel Martinez, what's your assessment of Colonel Morrison's fitness for command?" Every person in the immediate area held their breath. Morrison's career, his reputation, his future in the military all hung on Sarah's response. After the way he had treated her, she would be completely justified in recommending his immediate relief from command. Sarah looked directly at Morrison as she answered. "General, Colonel Morrison made serious errors in judgment that resulted in unnecessary casualties. However, he's also been serving in active combat zones for 15 years with a distinguished record. Last night's failures appear to stem from communication breakdowns and insufficient briefing on special operations protocols rather than fundamental incompetence." Morrison felt a mixture of relief and shame wash over him. Sarah was giving him another chance, despite having every reason to end his career. General Hawthorne considered this assessment. "Colonel Morrison, you will remain in command of this base, but you will be receiving additional training on intelligence assessment and special operations coordination. Colonel Martinez will be conducting that training personally." The general turned to address the group of officers who had gathered around. "What happened here last night stays classified at the highest levels. Colonel Martinez's true identity and role are not to be discussed outside of official channels. Is that understood?" A chorus of "Yes, ma'am" echoed from the assembled group. As the general and her team departed, Morrison found himself alone with Sarah in the command bunker. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and unresolved tensions. "Why?" Morrison finally asked. "Why didn't you end my career when you had the chance?" Sarah looked out through the bunker's reinforced windows at the base that was already beginning to repair the damage from the night's attack. "Because good soldiers made mistakes sometimes, Colonel. What matters is whether they learn from those mistakes." Morrison followed her gaze. "I've been in the Army for 20 years, and I thought I understood how things worked. I thought rank meant everything. That experience was the only thing that mattered." "Rank is important," Sarah agreed. "But it's not the only thing that matters. Intelligence, adaptability, and the willingness to listen to good advice regardless of where it comes from, those things matter too." Morrison turned to face her directly. "The way I treated you was unacceptable. Not just because of your actual rank, but because it was wrong regardless. You were trying to protect the lives of everyone on this base, and I made it personal." Sarah nodded. "Apology accepted, Colonel, but I need to know that if this situation arises again, you'll be able to set aside assumptions and focus on the mission." "You have my word," Morrison said firmly, "and you have my respect. I should have seen past the surface to recognize competence when it was right in front of me." In the days that followed, word of what had happened spread through the base in whispered conversations and knowing looks. The soldiers who had witnessed Morrison's treatment of Sarah saw him making a genuine effort to change his approach to leadership. He began seeking input from junior officers, reviewing intelligence reports more carefully, and treating all personnel with the respect their contributions deserved, rather than simply deferring to rank and seniority. Sarah continued her mission under her cover identity, but now with the added responsibility of helping Morrison become the kind of leader his soldiers needed. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that the woman he had tried to humiliate was now his mentor in becoming a better commander. Months later, as Morrison prepared to rotate back to the United States, he sought out Sarah one final time. I learned more about leadership from you in 3 months than I had in the previous 3 years, he told her. You could have destroyed me, but instead you chose to build me up. That's the kind of leader I want to be. Sarah smiled. The best leaders are the ones who recognize that leadership isn't about commanding respect through rank or intimidation. It's about earning respect through competence, integrity, and the ability to put mission and personnel above personal ego. Morrison nodded, finally understanding a lesson that had taken him far too long to learn. As he walked away from Forward Operating Base Phoenix for the last time, he carried with him not just the memory of his failures, but the knowledge of how to do better. And somewhere in a classified file that he would never see, Sarah Martinez had written a final report recommending Colonel Morrison for promotion to brigade command, noting his remarkable growth in leadership capabilities and his newfound understanding of how to value contributions regardless of their source. The colonel who had once ridiculed her had become exactly the kind of leader the military needed, and Sarah had discovered that sometimes the greatest victory wasn't in revealing your superiority, but in helping others discover their own potential for growth.